This baby had an accident and fell from the cliff when this mother bear did something shocking. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The wind whistled through the tall pine trees surrounding the small cabin nestled at the edge of Pinecrest Forest. Oliver and Grace Bennett had moved to this remote location just 3 months ago, seeking peace and quiet away from the busy city life. Their cabin sat dangerously close to Eagle's Peak Cliff, a beautiful but treacherous drop that plummeted nearly 60 feet to a rocky ledge below, before continuing another 100 feet down to the forest floor. Their 6-month-old daughter, Rosie, was the light of their lives. With rosy cheeks and bright blue eyes that sparkled with curiosity, she had just started crawling, exploring her world with innocent wonder. Grace had set up a playpen on the back porch where Rosie could safely enjoy the fresh mountain air, while Grace tended to her small garden just a few feet away. That crisp autumn morning started like any other. The leaves had turned brilliant shades of orange and red, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine through the air. Grace placed Rosie in her playpen with her favorite stuffed bunny and stepped inside to answer a phone call from Oliver, who had gone into town for supplies. "I'll be back in about an hour," Oliver said through the crackling connection. "The truck needs some work, and the mechanic can take it now if I leave it." "That's fine," Grace replied, glancing out the window at Rosie, who was happily playing. "We're just enjoying the morning. Take your time." What Grace didn't notice was the small gap in the playpen's gate, a latch that hadn't quite clicked shut when she'd placed Rosie inside. Nor did she see the bright yellow butterfly that fluttered down onto the porch railing, capturing Rosie's attention completely. In the dense forest below the cliff, a mother bear named Luna by local rangers roamed with her 2 cubs. She was a massive creature with thick brown fur and watchful eyes. The locals knew her well. She kept to herself and was typically not aggressive unless her cubs were threatened. Luna had been teaching her young ones how to forage for berries and roots before the long winter ahead forced them into hibernation. Back at the cabin, Grace poured herself a cup of tea, still on the phone with Oliver, as he discussed the repairs needed for their truck. The signal kept cutting out, and she moved around the kitchen trying to find better reception, her back now turned away from the window overlooking the porch. The colorful butterfly danced in the breeze, moving from the railing to the edge of Rosie's playpen. The baby girl's eyes widened with delight. She dropped her stuffed bunny and pushed against the loose gate. With surprising strength for such a tiny person, she managed to create just enough space to squeeze through. On all fours, Rosie crawled toward the mesmerizing butterfly. Her small hands patted at the wooden porch floor as she made her way closer to the edge. The butterfly lifted into the air again, floating just beyond the porch's border, hovering over the dangerous drop below. Grace's voice carried from inside the cabin. "Rosie, Mommy will be right there to check on you." But Rosie didn't understand. All she knew was the beautiful yellow wings that seemed to be playing a game with her. Just a little farther, just a little more. Down in the forest, Luna's ears perked up. Her sensitive hearing caught a sound that didn't belong, not the usual forest noises she was accustomed to. She lifted her nose to the air, catching an unfamiliar scent carried on the wind. Something about it made her pause, a maternal instinct stirring deep within. On the porch, Rosie's tiny fingers reached the very edge. The weathered wood of the porch had no railing on one side, an oversight the Bennetts had planned to fix that very weekend. The butterfly fluttered just inches away, and Rosie stretched out her hand, determined to touch those fascinating yellow wings. The rotted wood at the edge crumbled under her weight. In an instant, Rosie's curious exploration turned to terror as she felt nothing beneath her hands. Her baby babble turned into a frightened cry as she tumbled forward over the edge of the cliff. Grace's heart stopped as she heard the cry. Dropping the phone, she raced toward the porch, calling out, "Rosie! Rosie!" But when she burst through the door, the playpen was empty, its gate askew. The stuffed bunny lay abandoned on the floor. And from somewhere below the cliff, she heard her baby's cries echoing against the rocks. "Rosie!" Grace screamed, falling to her knees at the cliff's edge, her eyes frantically searching the rocky landscape below. There, on a narrow ledge about 20 feet down, lay her precious baby, crying but alive, having landed on a bed of fallen leaves that had softened her fall. But the ledge was narrow, and any movement from Rosie could send her plummeting the rest of the way down the cliff. Grace scrambled back into the cabin, grabbing her phone, but the call with Oliver had already disconnected. With shaking hands, she dialed emergency services, but the same poor reception that had plagued her call with Oliver now prevented her from reaching help. "Please, please, please," she sobbed, trying the call again and again. Each failed attempt sent her running back to the cliff's edge to make sure Rosie was still there, still safe on that precarious ledge. Down below, Luna had left her cubs in a small hollow and was making her way toward the strange sounds. The cries of the human baby echoed in a way that resonated with her own maternal instincts. She moved cautiously, her powerful body navigating the forest floor with surprising grace for a creature of her size. Grace, desperate beyond reason, began looking for a way down the cliff face. There was a narrow trail, hardly more than a deer path, that wound its way down, but it would take precious minutes to reach Rosie, minutes during which any movement from her baby could be fatal. And then, Grace saw something that made her blood run cold. From the forest below, a massive brown bear emerged, its head tilted upward toward the ledge where Rosie lay, crying. "No, no, no," Grace whispered, terror gripping her heart. "Please, God, no." Luna approached the base of the cliff, her nose working to identify the strange scent. The cries from above pulled at something deep within her, a recognition of a baby in distress that transcended species. She began to climb, her powerful claws finding purchase in the rocky cliff face. Grace watched in horror as the bear climbed higher, moving toward her helpless child. She screamed and waved her arms, trying to frighten the animal away, but Luna paid her no attention. With surprising agility, the bear navigated the cliff face, drawing ever closer to Rosie. In that moment, Grace made a decision born of pure maternal desperation. If the bear was going to reach her baby, she would be there too. She plunged onto the narrow trail, half running, half sliding down the rocky path, ignoring the cuts and bruises as she fell repeatedly in her haste. Luna reached the ledge where Rosie lay. The baby's cries had softened to whimpers as she exhausted herself. The bear loomed over the tiny human, casting a shadow across her small form. Grace was only halfway down the path, screaming Rosie's name, when she saw something that would forever change her understanding of the natural world. Instead of attacking, Luna gently nudged Rosie away from the edge of the ledge with her nose. The massive bear then carefully lay down beside the baby, her warm body creating a barrier between the infant and the deadly drop beyond. Rosie, perhaps too young to know fear, or perhaps finding comfort in the bear's warm fur, stopped crying and stared up at the creature with wide, curious eyes. Grace froze on the path, unable to process what she was seeing. The enormous predator was protecting her child. A sudden rumble of thunder broke the silence. Dark clouds had gathered unnoticed during the crisis, and now the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. The storm had appeared with frightening speed, as mountain weather often did. Grace knew she had only minutes before the narrow path she stood on would become a dangerous mudslide. "Rosie," Grace called out, her voice competing with the growing wind. She took another step down the path but stopped as Luna's massive head swung in her direction. The bear's eyes locked with hers, and Grace felt a chill run through her body that had nothing to do with the rain now soaking through her clothes. Luna made a low, rumbling sound in her throat. It wasn't aggressive, but it was clear. "Stay back." Grace's mind raced. Every instinct screamed at her to rush to her baby, to snatch Rosie from the jaws of death, both the cliff's edge and the bear beside her. But something in Luna's behavior made her hesitate. The bear hadn't harmed Rosie. In fact, she seemed to be shielding the baby from the worsening storm. The rain intensified, turning the dusty cliff face slick with mud. Small rivulets began to form, washing tiny stones and debris over the edge. Grace clung to a stunted pine growing from the path, realizing that one wrong move could send her plummeting to her death, and then who would save Rosie? Lightning flashed, illuminating the scene in stark relief. In that brilliant moment, Grace saw that Luna wasn't alone. Two small cubs had emerged from the forest below, calling for their mother with anxious cries that were nearly lost in the storm. Luna responded with a deep call that vibrated through the air. The cubs attempted to climb the cliff face to reach her, but they were too small, too inexperienced. They slipped on the wet rocks, crying out in distress. Luna looked down at her cubs, then at the human baby beside her. Grace could almost see the conflict in the bear's eyes, a mother's impossible choice. What happened next would haunt Grace's dreams for years to come. Luna rose to her feet, her massive form towering over tiny Rosie. With extraordinary gentleness, the bear picked up the baby by the collar of her overalls, lifting her as carefully as she would one of her own cubs. "No!" Grace screamed, certain that her worst nightmare was unfolding before her eyes. She lunged forward, slipping on the muddy path and nearly falling over the edge. Only a desperate grab at a protruding root saved her from disaster. But Luna wasn't attacking Rosie. Instead, the bear began to move along the ledge, away from the most dangerous section where mud and water were now pouring over the cliff's edge. With Rosie dangling from her mouth, Luna navigated to a more sheltered part of the ledge, where an overhang provided some protection from the downpour. Grace watched, her heart in her throat, as the bear placed Rosie in this safer spot, then turned back toward her crying cubs. The ledge where Rosie now lay was still perilous, but it was marginally safer from both the storm and the risk of falling. Luna's cubs continued to cry from below, clearly distressed by the separation from their mother and frightened by the storm. The mother bear looked back at Rosie one last time, then began to descend the cliff face, moving with surprising speed despite the treacherous conditions. Grace saw her chance. The path she stood on curved around toward the section of ledge where Rosie now lay. If she hurried, she might reach her baby before Luna returned, if the bear intended to return at all. Slipping and sliding on the muddy trail, Grace made her way forward. The rain pounded against her face, nearly blinding her. Twice she fell to her knees, and once her foot slipped entirely off the path, leaving her dangling for a heart-stopping moment before she could pull herself back up. Finally, she reached a point where she could see Rosie clearly. Her baby was lying on her back under the rocky overhang, wet but apparently unhurt. Just a few more yards along the path, and Grace would reach a spot where she might be able to climb down to the ledge. Then she heard it, a scream of pain and fear that cut through the storm's fury. It wasn't human. It was the cry of a bear cub. Grace turned to look back down the cliff. In the valley below, she could make out a new shape moving through the trees. A mountain lion, its tawny body sleek with rain. It had one of Luna's cubs in its jaws. Luna was charging toward the predator, her roar of maternal fury echoing off the mountainside. But the second cub was in danger too, frozen in terror as the mountain lion's mate circled around behind it. Nature's cruel drama was playing out below, but Grace couldn't spare it more than a glance. This was her opportunity. With Luna distracted by the threat to her own babies, Grace could rescue Rosie without confronting the massive bear. She reached the point where she could attempt to climb down to the ledge. The rocks were slippery with rain, but maternal determination gave her strength and focus she never knew she possessed. Carefully, she lowered herself over the edge of the path. Her foot found a narrow outcropping, and her hands gripped the wet stone with desperate strength. Inch by inch, she made her way down toward Rosie, who had begun to cry again, perhaps sensing her mother's presence. "I'm coming, baby," Grace called through the rain. "Mommy's coming." Her foot slipped, and for a terrifying moment she hung by her fingertips, the long drop below her waiting for any mistake. Summoning every ounce of strength, she regained her footing and continued her descent. At last, her feet touched the ledge. Rosie lay just a few feet away, her face red from crying, her clothes soaked from the rain despite the partial shelter of the overhang. Grace moved toward her baby, arms outstretched. Rosie saw her and reached up with tiny hands. That's when Grace heard the growl behind her. She turned slowly, her body instinctively moving to shield Rosie. There, having climbed back up the cliff with astonishing speed, stood Luna. The bear's fur was matted with rain and something darker. Blood. Whether it was her own or from the confrontation with the mountain lion, Grace couldn't tell. What was clear was that Luna's remaining cub was nowhere to be seen. The bear took a step forward onto the ledge, her massive paw splashing in a puddle of rainwater. Her eyes were fixed not on Grace, but on Rosie. There was something in that gaze that transcended species, a look of loss, of protective fury, and of determination. Grace understood with sudden clarity. Luna had lost her cub, and now, driven by grief or maternal instinct gone awry, she had returned for Rosie. "Please," Grace whispered, though she knew the bear couldn't understand her words. "Please, don't take my baby." Luna took another step forward. The ledge, already narrow, left no room for Grace to retreat. Behind her was the sheer drop of the cliff, hundreds of feet down to the rocks below. Before her was a grieving mother bear, possibly the most dangerous creature she could face. Grace made the only choice she could. She scooped Rosie into her arms and held her close, then turned her back to the bear, using her own body to shield her child. If Luna was going to take Rosie, she would have to go through Grace first. She closed her eyes, waiting for the crushing blow of claws or teeth. Instead, she felt warmth. Luna had moved forward, but not to attack. The massive bear pressed her body against Grace's back, her thick fur radiating heat despite the cold rain. She was sheltering them both, creating a wall of protection against the storm and the deadly drop. Grace stood frozen, afraid to move or speak. Rosie, nestled against her chest, had stopped crying and was looking over her mother's shoulder at the bear with curious eyes. For what seemed like an eternity, they remained that way. The human mother clutching her child, the bear mother pressed against them, all three caught in a moment that defied explanation. Then Luna made a soft huffing sound and stepped back. She looked at Grace, then at Rosie, then up at the path that led back to the top of the cliff. It was as if she was showing them the way to safety. Understanding dawned on Grace. With infinite care, she turned and began to edge along the ledge toward the spot where she had climbed down. Luna followed, her massive body between them and the drop, acting as a living guardrail. When they reached the climbing point, Grace hesitated. How could she scale the cliff face while holding Rosie? She looked helplessly at the wet rocks, then back at Luna. The bear made that same huffing sound again. Then, slowly, she lowered herself onto her belly on the ledge, her back level with Grace's waist. It couldn't be, it wasn't possible. And yet, with no other options, Grace carefully, cautiously placed one leg over Luna's broad back. The bear remained motionless. Taking a leap of faith that went against every natural instinct, Grace climbed onto Luna's back, cradling Rosie tightly against her chest. As soon as she was settled, Luna rose to her feet. With deliberate movements, the bear began to climb the cliff face, carrying her human cargo with the same care she would have shown her own cubs. Grace clung to the thick fur, her mind unable to process what was happening. Rosie, remarkably, had fallen asleep against her chest, exhausted by the ordeal. Step by careful step, Luna carried them up the cliff, finding secure footholds where Grace could never have managed while carrying a baby. The rain continued to fall, but it was easing now, the worst of the storm passing as quickly as it had arrived. At last, they reached the path. Luna paused, allowing Grace to slide off her back onto solid ground. Grace stood trembling, Rosie still sleeping in her arms, as she faced the creature who had saved both their lives. "Thank you," she whispered, the words wholly inadequate for what had just occurred. Luna regarded them for a long moment. Then she turned her head toward the forest below, where her remaining cub might still be fighting for its life, or already lost. With one last look at the human mother and child, Luna turned and began to make her way back down the cliff, disappearing into the mist and rain. Grace stood watching until the bear was out of sight. Then, clutching Rosie close to her heart, she began the treacherous journey back up the path to the cabin. The rain had stopped entirely by the time she reached the top. As she stepped onto the solid ground of her backyard, legs shaking from exertion and lingering fear, she heard the sound of a vehicle approaching. Oliver's truck came bouncing up the dirt road, followed by an emergency response vehicle. He must have been trying to call home, received no answer, and rushed back with help. Oliver leaped from the truck before it had fully stopped, his face a mask of panic. When he saw Grace standing there with Rosie in her arms, both of them soaked and muddy but alive, he ran to them, enfolding them both in his embrace. "What happened?" he asked, pulling back to examine them for injuries. "I kept calling and calling. When you didn't answer, I thought—" Grace looked over her husband's shoulder at the cliff's edge, where their ordinary life had transformed into something extraordinary. How could she possibly explain what had happened? Who would believe a story about a mother bear carrying a human baby to safety, then serving as a mount to rescue them both? "Rosie fell," she said simply, her voice rough with emotion. "But we're okay now. We're both okay." The emergency responders approached, insisting on examining both Grace and Rosie, despite Grace's assurances that they were unharmed. As a paramedic checked Rosie for injuries, the baby woke and immediately began making a strange huffing sound, an uncanny imitation of Luna's vocalization. Grace and Oliver spent the night in the hospital with Rosie, though the doctors found nothing wrong with any of them beyond minor scrapes and bruises. Grace told a simplified version of events, that Rosie had fallen to a ledge, and she had managed to climb down and rescue her. She kept Luna's role in the miracle to herself, uncertain whether anyone would believe the truth. When they returned home the next day, Oliver immediately set to work installing secure railings around the entire porch. Grace stood at the cliff's edge, looking down at the ledge where disaster had nearly claimed her daughter's life. From this distance, it seemed impossible that anyone could have survived such a fall, let alone been rescued from that narrow shelf of rock. "We should move," Oliver said, coming to stand beside her. "This place isn't safe for Rosie." Grace started to agree, but something stopped her. She looked out across the valley at the vast forest stretching below them. Somewhere out there, Luna might still be searching for her lost cub, or mourning its loss, or, Grace hoped desperately, reunited with both her babies. "Let's wait," she said, "just a little while." That night, after Rosie was safely asleep in her crib, Grace slipped outside onto the newly secured porch. The full moon illuminated the landscape with silvery light. Grace stood at the railing, looking out over the forest. "Thank you," she whispered into the night. "I don't know if you can hear me or if you'd understand even if you could, but thank you for saving my baby. I hope your babies are safe too." As if in answer, a distant huffing sound carried on the night breeze. It could have been the wind or her imagination, but Grace preferred to believe it was Luna, acknowledging the bond they now shared. Two mothers who had transcended the boundaries of species to protect the most precious things in their world. A week passed, then two. Grace found herself often standing at the edge of the cliff, scanning the forest below for any sign of Luna and her cubs. Oliver worried about her preoccupation, suggesting again that they should move away from this place of trauma. But Grace couldn't leave. Not yet. Something held her here. Some unfinished business that she couldn't explain even to herself. Autumn deepened. The brilliant colors of the forest began to fade as leaves fell from the trees. Soon winter would arrive, bringing snow to the mountains and sending the bears into hibernation. Grace was hanging laundry on the clothesline one crisp morning when she heard Rosie making that strange huffing sound again from her playpen, now securely placed in the center of the porch with a gate that double-latched. The baby had continued to make this noise occasionally, as if it had imprinted on her during her ordeal, but this time the sound was answered. From the edge of the forest emerged Luna, her massive form unmistakable even at a distance. Behind her trailed not one but two cubs, including one that moved with a slight limp, injured but alive. Grace froze, the damp shirt she'd been hanging forgotten in her hands. Luna had survived, and somehow, miraculously, so had both her cubs. The bear family moved to the base of the cliff directly below the Bennett cabin. Luna stopped there, looking up toward the porch where Grace stood. For a long moment, their eyes met across the distance. Two mothers, forever connected by an impossible moment of trust. Then Luna huffed once more, turned, and led her cubs back into the forest. Grace watched until they disappeared among the trees. That evening, when Oliver returned from work, Grace finally told him the full story of what had happened on the cliff. She expected disbelief, perhaps even concern for her mental state after such a traumatic experience. Instead, Oliver listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "The local rangers mentioned an unusual bear sighting today," he said finally. "A mother with two cubs, one injured. They were surprised to see them still active this late in the season instead of preparing for hibernation." He reached across the table and took her hand. They were right at the base of our cliff. Tears filled Grace's eyes as the confirmation of her experience sank in. It hadn't been a hallucination born of fear and adrenaline. Luna was real, and what had happened between them was real too. "What do we do now?" Oliver asked softly. Grace squeezed his hand. "We stay," she said with certainty. "This is where we're meant to be." That night, as the first snow of winter began to fall outside their window, Grace told Rosie a bedtime story, not the sanitized fairy tales from children's books, but a new story, one about a baby who fell from a cliff and the mother bear who saved her. A story about two different kinds of mothers who found common ground in their fierce love for their children. A story about miracles that happen in ordinary places, if only we have eyes to see them. As Rosie drifted off to sleep, Grace could have sworn she heard that now familiar huffing sound from somewhere deep in the forest. Tonight it sounded like goodbye, at least until spring. Luna and her cubs would be denning soon, sleeping away the winter months until the warmth returned to the mountains. Grace went to the window and looked out at the snow-dusted landscape. "Sleep well," she whispered. "We'll be here when you wake." Winter settled over the mountains, wrapping the Bennett cabin in a blanket of white. Grace and Oliver reinforced the railings, installed additional safety measures, and made the cliffside property as secure as possible for their increasingly mobile daughter. Rosie grew stronger each day, seemingly unaffected by her near-tragic fall. The only lingering sign of her experience was the huffing sound she still made when looking out at the forest, as if calling to a friend she somehow remembered. One snowy afternoon, a package arrived from the university in the nearby town. Oliver had reached out to a wildlife biologist there, describing Luna's behavior without revealing the full extent of her interaction with Rosie and Grace. The professor had sent back a thick folder of research papers and a handwritten note. While bears have occasionally been documented showing peculiar behaviors toward human children in distress, your account describes something extraordinary. There are legends in many indigenous cultures about the kinship between human and bear mothers, stories dismissed as mere folklore by modern science. Perhaps we've been too quick to draw lines between our world and theirs. That night, as a winter storm howled outside their windows, Grace placed a candle in the window facing the forest. It was an old custom she had read about, a light to guide travelers home through the dark. "For Luna," she explained when Oliver raised a questioning eyebrow, "so she knows where to find us when spring comes." Oliver smiled and placed his arm around her shoulders. "Do you think she'll come back?" Grace leaned into his embrace, watching the candle's flame dance in the darkness. "I know she will," she said. "Some bonds can't be broken, not by winter, not by differences, not even by time." Down in the deep den, hollowed from the side of the mountain, Luna curled protectively around her sleeping cubs. The injured one had healed well and would be strong enough to face the coming spring. As sleep pulled her toward hibernation, her dreams were filled with strange images. A small, helpless creature with no fur, looking up at her with trust in its eyes. A mother's desperate love, mirroring her own. An understanding that transcended all barriers. In her dreaming bear's heart, Luna, too, knew they would meet again when the snow melted and new life returned to the mountain. Spring came to the mountains with a gentle persistence. Snow retreated up the slopes, wildflowers pushed through the softening earth, and the forest awakened with new sounds. Grace found herself watching the tree line each morning, looking for signs of movement, for the familiar shape of Luna and her cubs emerging from their winter sleep. Rosie had grown remarkably during the winter months, now walking with the wobbling determination of a toddler. She had developed a particular fascination with bears, pointing excitedly to any pictures of them in her books and making that distinctive huffing sound that had become second nature to her. "She remembers," Grace told Oliver one evening as they watched Rosie playing with a stuffed bear that had become her inseparable companion. "Somehow she remembers Luna." Oliver, who had once been skeptical, now nodded in agreement. "I believe you," he said quietly. "Both of you." The changes in their family extended beyond Rosie's bear fixation. Since the incident at the cliff, Grace had found herself more attuned to the natural world around them. She noticed details she had previously overlooked: the distinct calls of different birds, the patterns of deer movement through the forest below, the subtle shifts in weather before storms arrived. It was as if her encounter with Luna had awakened something primitive and knowing inside her, some ancient connection between humans and the wilderness that modern life had buried. Oliver had embraced this change in his wife, supporting her when she decided to reach out to the local wildlife conservation group. Grace now volunteered 2 days a week, helping to educate visitors about the importance of respecting the forest and its inhabitants. She never shared the full story of Luna's rescue, but her passion for protecting the bears was evident to everyone who met her. "There's a mother bear with 2 yearling cubs that's been spotted near Cripple Creek," Ranger Davis told Grace one morning at the conservation center. "The description matches that bear you've asked about, the one with the injured cub from last fall." Grace's heart quickened. "How far is that from our cabin?" "About 5 miles as the crow flies. Bears cover a lot of territory once they're out of hibernation, especially mothers teaching their cubs to forage." 5 miles. Close enough that Luna might wander near their cabin again. Grace tried to temper her excitement with realism. Wild bears didn't make social visits after all, but still, the possibility of seeing Luna and her cubs again filled her with anticipation. That weekend, as the Bennett family ate breakfast on their secure porch, enjoying the spring sunshine, Rosie suddenly stopped eating her oatmeal. She turned toward the forest and made her huffing sound, louder and more insistent than Grace had ever heard it. "What is it, sweetie?" Oliver asked, following his daughter's gaze. And then they saw them. At the very edge of the clearing below their cliff, 3 bears had emerged from the trees. Even from this distance, Grace recognized Luna's distinctive form, now leaner after the winter's sleep but still powerful and majestic. Behind her trailed 2 adolescent cubs, including the one that had been injured in the mountain lion attack. It was still slightly smaller than its sibling, but moved confidently, its limp barely noticeable. "It's her," Grace whispered, hardly daring to move. "It's Luna." As if hearing her name, the mother bear looked up toward the cabin. For a breathtaking moment, Grace felt certain their eyes met across the distance. Luna huffed, the exact sound that Rosie had been imitating all these months, and rose onto her hind legs, her powerful form reaching toward the sky. Rosie squealed with delight, bouncing in her high chair and pointing. "Bay! Bay!" she exclaimed, her baby pronunciation of bear filled with recognition and joy. Luna remained standing for several seconds, as if making sure the Bennett family had seen her. Then she dropped back to all fours, huffed once more, and led her cubs in a deliberate circuit along the base of the cliff, passing directly below the spot where Rosie had fallen and been rescued, before disappearing back into the forest. The encounter lasted less than a minute, but it left Grace trembling with emotion. It hadn't been a coincidence. Luna had come to show them her healthy cubs, to let them see that all was well with her family, just as all was well with theirs. "Did that really just happen?" Oliver asked, his voice hushed with wonder. Grace nodded, unable to speak through the tightness in her throat. She reached over to stroke Rosie's soft curls, marveling at the miraculous chain of events that had led to this moment. A baby's fall that should have ended in tragedy had instead created a bond between 2 mothers that defied explanation. Throughout that spring and summer, Luna and her cubs made periodic appearances near the Bennett cabin, never approaching too closely, but always visible enough that Grace could see how the cubs were growing, how well they were thriving under their mother's care. Each time, Rosie would spot them first, making her huffing call that Luna unfailingly answered. Word of the unusual bear behavior spread through the nearby town. Some locals dismissed it as coincidence, but others, particularly those from indigenous communities with long-standing bear traditions, recognized something profound in what Grace hesitantly shared of her experience. Claire Whitetail, an elder from the local tribe, visited the Bennett cabin one warm afternoon in late summer. She sat with Grace on the porch, watching Rosie play in her secure yard area. "My grandmother would tell stories of the bear women," Claire said, her weathered hands cradling a cup of tea. "Mothers who could take the form of bears to protect their children, and bears who sometimes protected human children as if they were their own. Most people think they're just legends." Grace looked out toward the forest, where Luna and her cubs might at that moment be foraging for berries or teaching the youngsters to fish in the stream. "What do you think?" she asked. Claire smiled, the lines around her eyes deepening. "I think there are mysteries in this world that we're not meant to fully understand, but I believe something sacred happened between you and that mother bear, a recognition that goes beyond what science can explain." As summer faded into autumn once more, Grace noticed a change in Luna's visiting pattern. The bear family appeared less frequently, and when they did, they stayed for shorter periods. The cubs, now nearly as large as their mother, showed increasing independence, sometimes exploring on their own while Luna watched from a distance. "They're growing up," Oliver observed after one such sighting. "They'll be leaving her soon, finding their own territories." Grace nodded, feeling a bittersweet pang. It was the natural order of things, but still, she would miss seeing the family together. The last visit came on a brilliant October day, the forest ablaze with the same autumn colors that had decorated the landscape when Rosie fell from the cliff a year before. Luna appeared alone at the edge of the clearing, her cubs nowhere to be seen. For a long time, she stood looking up at the Bennett cabin. Grace brought Rosie outside, holding the now sturdy toddler securely in her arms. "Look, Rosie," she said softly. "It's Luna. Can you say goodbye?" Rosie made her huffing sound, waving her small hand in what seemed remarkably like a deliberate gesture of farewell. Luna rose onto her hind legs once more, her powerful form silhouetted against the colorful forest behind her. She huffed 3 times, a clear response to Rosie's call, then dropped back to all fours. With one last look toward the mother and child on the porch, she turned and disappeared into the trees. Grace knew with a certainty that bypassed rational thought that this was Luna's final visit. The cubs were independent now, and Luna would be seeking a mate again, continuing the cycle of bear life that had persisted in these mountains for thousands of years. That evening, Grace stood at the edge of their property, looking out over the vista that had become so much more than just a view to her. In the year since Rosie's fall, this place had transformed from a scenic location for their home into a landscape filled with meaning and connection. "Thank you," she whispered to the gathering darkness, knowing that somewhere in the vastness of the forest, Luna might be settling down for the night. "Thank you for everything." As if in answer, a distant huffing sound floated up from the valley below, so faint it might have been just the wind in the trees, but Grace chose to believe otherwise. Years passed. Rosie grew from a toddler into a curious, nature-loving child who had no conscious memory of her fall or the bear who had saved her. Yet something of that experience seemed woven into her being. She showed an uncanny affinity for animals, especially bears, and never exhibited the fear that many children developed toward wild creatures. The Bennett family remained in their cabin by the cliff, though they had expanded and reinforced it as their family grew to include a younger brother for Rosie. They never saw Luna again after that final farewell, but occasionally, reports would reach them of an unusually large female bear who showed remarkable tolerance around humans. On Rosie's 6th birthday, Grace took her daughter to a special spot they had created at the edge of their property, a small garden bordered by stones collected from the base of the cliff. In the center stood a simple wooden carving of a mother bear with her cubs, crafted by a local artist according to Grace's detailed description. "Why do we have this, Mommy?" Rosie asked, touching the carving with gentle fingers. "You never told me." Grace knelt beside her daughter, looking into eyes that somehow held the same innocent curiosity they had shown when looking up at Luna from that precarious ledge. How much should she share? How much could a 6-year-old understand about the miracle that had saved her life? "It's to remind us that sometimes help comes from unexpected places," Grace said carefully. "And that being a mother means protecting babies, no matter whose babies they are." Rosie considered this, her small face serious. "Like how you help take care of the bear cubs with your conservation work." Grace smiled, stroking her daughter's hair. "Exactly like that." As they turned to walk back to the cabin, where Oliver was setting up for Rosie's birthday party, a familiar sound reached them on the breeze, a soft huffing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Rosie stopped, tilting her head to listen. Then, without hesitation, she replied with her own perfect imitation of the sound, a skill she had somehow retained all these years. Grace felt goosebumps rise on her arms despite the warm spring day. Could it be? After all this time? "What was that, Mommy?" Rosie asked. Grace put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "That, my sweet girl, is the beginning of a very long story. A true story about you and a very special bear named Luna. I think you're finally old enough to hear it." As they walked hand in hand toward the cabin, Grace felt a deep sense of rightness settle over her. The circle was complete. The story that had begun in fear and near tragedy had transformed into one of connection, wonder, and the fierce protective love that united mothers of all species. Somewhere in the vast forest beyond their home, perhaps Luna still roamed. Perhaps her descendants now explored the familiar territories she had once claimed as her own. Grace liked to imagine that the memory of that remarkable encounter lived on in bear consciousness just as it did in human hearts, a testament to the mysterious ways in which all living things are connected in this world of wonders. In the years that followed, as Rosie grew into a young woman with a passion for wildlife biology, she would often stand at the edge of the cliff where she had fallen as a baby, looking out over the forest below. Though she had no conscious memory of Luna, the story had become part of her identity, shaping her path in life and opening her heart to the possibility that the boundaries between human and animal worlds were far more permeable than science had yet discovered. And sometimes, when the wind was just right and the forest was quiet, she would make that special huffing call, a sound that bridged two worlds, two mothers, and a miracle that would never be forgotten. When Rosie turned 18, she announced her intention to study wildlife biology at the university, where Dr. Eliza Chen, the professor who had corresponded with her father years ago about Luna's unusual behavior, now led an innovative research program on bear cognition. "I want to understand what happened with Luna," Rosie told her parents, as they sat around the dinner table in the cabin that had been her home all her life. Not just the science of it, but the meaning of it. Grace and Oliver exchanged a look filled with shared memories. Their daughter had grown into a thoughtful young woman with an uncanny connection to the natural world. Her childhood huffing sound had evolved into a remarkable ability to interpret animal behavior that even experienced rangers found impressive. And sometimes, when the wind was just right and the forest was quiet, she would make that special huffing call, a sound that bridged two worlds, two mothers, and a miracle that would never be forgotten. When Rosie turned 18, she announced her intention to study wildlife biology at the university, where Dr. Eliza Chen, the professor who had corresponded with her father years ago about Luna's unusual behavior, now led an innovative research program on bear cognition. "I want to understand what happened with Luna," Rosie told her parents, as they sat around the dinner table in the cabin that had been her home all her life. Not just the science of it, but the meaning of it. Grace and Oliver exchanged a look filled with shared memories. Their daughter had grown into a thoughtful young woman with an uncanny connection to the natural world. Her childhood huffing sound had evolved into a remarkable ability to interpret animal behavior that even experienced rangers found impressive. "We've always known this was your path," Grace said, reaching across the table to squeeze her daughter's hand. Ever since that day on the cliff. 2 months later, they drove Rosie to the university campus, her bedroom now packed into boxes and suitcases. As they helped her settle into her dormitory, a notice on the student bulletin board caught Rosie's eye. "Research assistants needed for black bear study. Freshman welcome." "It's a sign," she whispered to her mother, pointing to the flyer. Grace felt a familiar shiver run through her, the same one she'd experienced whenever Luna made an appearance near their cabin all those years ago. "I think you're right." The following week, after her parents had returned home, Rosie attended the informational meeting for the research position. The room was packed with students, mostly upperclassmen with experience already under their belts. Rosie sat quietly in the back, feeling intimidated by the confident voices around her discussing tracking methodologies and data analysis techniques. Dr. Chen entered the room last, a compact woman with silver-streaked black hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She scanned the assembled students, her gaze landing briefly on Rosie before she began her presentation about the research project, a comprehensive study of black bear communication patterns and cognitive abilities. "We know embarrassingly little about how bears communicate with each other, let alone how they might communicate with other species," Dr. Chen explained, advancing through slides of bears in various habitats. "There have been anecdotal reports of unusual interactions between bears and humans that suggest a level of understanding beyond what current science acknowledges, but these remain largely unstudied." Rosie's heart beat faster. This was exactly what she had come to learn about. After the presentation, students swarmed around Dr. Chen, eager to make an impression. Rosie hung back, uncertain how to approach. She had brought a copy of the letter Dr. Chen had written to her father years ago, but now she wondered if it would seem presumptuous to mention it. As the crowd thinned, Dr. Chen unexpectedly looked up and directly at Rosie. "You in the back," she called, "with the auburn hair, have we met?" Rosie stepped forward nervously. "No, Dr. Chen. I'm Rosie Bennett. I'm a freshman, but I have a personal interest in your research." Something flickered in Dr. Chen's expression. "Bennett? From Pinecrest?" Rosie nodded, surprised. "Yes. My father corresponded with you several years ago about a bear encounter our family had." Dr. Chen's eyes widened. "The baby who fell from the cliff? And the mother bear who—" She stopped, glancing around at the few remaining students who were watching with curious expressions. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation in my office." 20 minutes later, Rosie sat across from Dr. Chen in a cluttered office lined with books and bear photographs. She had just finished recounting the story of Luna's rescue, the full version that her parents had shared with her as she grew old enough to understand it. "I've thought about your family's experience for years," Dr. Chen said, leaning forward intently. It's one of the most extraordinary accounts of interspecies altruism I've ever encountered. I've wanted to follow up, but your father asked for discretion, and then I lost track when I changed universities. My parents were protecting me, Rosie explained. They were afraid of media attention or people thinking they were crazy. But I've never doubted the story. It's shaped who I am. Dr. Chen studied her thoughtfully. And you can still make that vocalization? The one the bear used? Rosie nodded, then demonstrated, producing the deep, huffing sound that had become as natural to her as speaking. Dr. Chen's expression was one of barely contained excitement. Remarkable. Do you know that's a specific vocalization female bears use with their cubs? It's a reassurance call, telling them they're safe. She paused. Rosie, would you consider joining my research team in a special capacity? Your experience and your ability with that vocalization could be invaluable. Rosie felt a surge of joy and purpose. It's why I came here. Within weeks, Rosie found herself deeply involved in Dr. Chen's research. While most assistants worked with data or helped maintain equipment, Rosie was invited to join the field team that occasionally visited a nearby wildlife sanctuary where several orphaned bears were being rehabilitated. On her first visit to the sanctuary, Rosie stood outside the enclosure that housed Mabel, a female black bear who had been rescued as a cub when her mother was killed by a car. Now, 3 years old, Mabel was healthy but had shown unusual anxiety around humans, except for her primary caretaker, Joe. Let's see if your special talent works on bears other than Luna, Dr. Chen said, standing a safe distance back. Just make the sound naturally, the way you would if you were calling to her. Rosie took a deep breath and made the huffing call she had practiced all her life. The sound echoed slightly in the clearing. Mabel, who had been foraging at the far end of her enclosure, instantly raised her head. Her ears swiveled forward, and she made a soft sound in response. Not identical to Rosie's call, but clearly related. Try again, Doctor, Chen whispered, her voice tight with suppressed excitement. Rosie repeated the sound, putting more feeling into it, trying to channel what she imagined Luna might have felt. Protective, reassuring, safe. This time, Mabel did something that made Joe, her caretaker, gasp in surprise. The bear walked directly toward the fence where Rosie stood, moving with purpose but without aggression. When she reached the barrier, she sat down, looking directly at Rosie with an intensity that made the hair on the young woman's arms stand up. She's never approached a stranger like that, Joe said in an undertone to Dr. Chen. Never. Mabel made a series of sounds, huffs and low rumbles that seemed directed specifically at Rosie. Without thinking, Rosie responded with similar sounds, a back and forth that felt strangely like a conversation. After several minutes, Mabel turned and ambled back to her foraging, but the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. Something profound had just occurred, and everyone present knew it. What did I just witness? Joe asked, looking between Rosie and Dr. Chen. Dr. Chen's eyes were shining. The beginning of something extraordinary, I think. Over the following months, Rosie's unusual ability became the centerpiece of a groundbreaking study. She worked with 5 different bears at the sanctuary, all of whom responded to her vocalizations in ways they didn't react to recordings of the same sounds or to other humans attempting to reproduce them. There's something in your voice they recognize, Dr. Chen theorized during one of their weekly reviews. Perhaps a tonal quality we can't detect, or maybe even scent markers in your breath. Bears have far more sensitive olfaction than humans. Rosie had her own theory, though she hesitated to share it with the scientifically minded professor. What if it's not physical at all? What if it's, emotional, intentional? To her surprise, Dr. Chen didn't dismiss the idea. Consciousness and communication are still largely mysterious to us, Rosie. We shouldn't dismiss any hypothesis at this stage. As her freshman year progressed, Rosie's work with Dr. Chen expanded. They developed a rudimentary dictionary of bear vocalizations, with Rosie's interpretations proving remarkably consistent with observed behaviors. The research began to attract attention from wildlife biologists around the country. During spring break, when most students headed home or to beaches, Rosie accompanied Dr. Chen and a small team to a remote area where wild bears were beginning to emerge from hibernation. They set up observation blinds near known denning sites, hoping to document natural communication behaviors among bear families. On their third day in the field, while positioned in a blind half a mile from the nearest known den, Rosie felt a strange, prickling sensation on the back of her neck. She turned from her observation equipment to look out the blind's rear window. Standing less than 30 feet away was an enormous black bear, a female by her size and features. She was staring directly at the blind as if she knew exactly who was inside. "Dr. Chen," Rosie whispered, barely breathing. "Behind us." The professor turned slowly, her expression changing from surprise to scientific interest. "She's magnificent, and she doesn't seem threatened by our presence at all." The bear took a step closer, then another. Instead of fear, Rosie felt a powerful sense of familiarity wash over her. "I don't think she's just any bear," she whispered. "Look at her left ear, there's a notch missing." Dr. Chen squinted through her binoculars. "You're right, and there's scarring on her right flank, from some old injury." Rosie's heart pounded. "Like a mountain lion attack, maybe?" "Dr. Chen, what if this is Luna?" The professor looked skeptical. "That would be quite a coincidence, Rosie. We're nearly 100 miles from your family's cabin." "Bears can range widely," Rosie countered, the certainty growing within her, especially after hibernation when they're re-establishing their territories. As if in response to her words, the bear made a distinctive huffing sound, the exact vocalization that Rosie had been replicating all her life. Without thinking about safety protocols or scientific procedure, Rosie unzipped the blind's entrance and stepped outside. "Rosie!" Dr. Chen hissed in alarm. "What are you doing?" But Rosie moved as if in a trance, stepping slowly toward the massive bear. When she was about 15 feet away, she stopped and made her answering huff. The bear's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. She rose onto her hind legs, towering nearly 7 feet tall, and made a series of sounds that seemed to vibrate through Rosie's very bones. "It's you," Rosie whispered, tears filling her eyes. "It's really you, Luna." Dr. Chen had emerged from the blind but remained at a safer distance, her camera capturing every moment of the extraordinary encounter. "Rosie," she called softly, "please be careful. Wild bears are unpredictable, even ones you believe you know." But Rosie felt no fear. The connection that had begun when she was an infant on a precarious ledge had somehow endured across time and distance. She wasn't being reckless. She was reconnecting with a presence that had shaped her entire life. Luna dropped back to all fours and approached Rosie with deliberate slowness. When just a few feet separated them, she stopped and extended her massive head, sniffing the air around the young woman. A memory flashed through Rosie's mind. Not her own, but one her mother had described countless times. Luna, gently picking up baby Rosie by her overalls, carrying her to safety. The sensory details were so vivid that Rosie wondered if some part of her had retained the experience after all, buried deep in her unconscious mind. She extended her hand, palm down, fingers slightly curled. A non-threatening gesture she had developed while working with the sanctuary bears. Luna sniffed her fingers, then made a soft sound in her throat that Rosie had never heard before. Not from any of the bears she had worked with. Not even in the extensive recordings Dr. Chen had collected over years of research. "What is she saying?" Dr. Chen called from behind her, the scientific curiosity temporarily overriding her concern for Rosie's safety. Rosie shook her head slightly. "I don't know, it's new to me." She tried to reproduce the sound, but her attempt was a poor approximation. Luna huffed again, then turned and walked a few paces away before looking back at Rosie expectantly. "I think she wants me to follow her," Rosie said, already taking a step forward. "Absolutely not," Dr. Chen responded firmly. "That's far too dangerous, even for you, Rosie." But Luna was insistent, moving forward, then turning to check that Rosie was coming. The bear's behavior reminded Rosie of stories her mother had told about how Luna had guided them up the cliff to safety. "I have to go," Rosie said, her voice steady with certainty. "This is why I'm here. This is what all our research has been leading toward." Dr. Chen looked torn between scientific opportunity and basic safety concerns. "Let me call in the rest of the team. We'll follow at a safe distance with tranquilizer guns just in case." Rosie nodded her agreement, though in her heart she knew Luna meant her no harm. As Dr. Chen spoke urgently into her radio, Rosie followed the bear, who seemed satisfied that her message had been understood. Luna led her through the forest with purpose, occasionally pausing to make sure Rosie was still behind her. They traveled for nearly 20 minutes, moving deeper into the wilderness, away from the observation blinds and known denning sites. Dr. Chen and 2 wildlife rangers followed at a distance, keeping Rosie in sight but hanging back enough to avoid spooking Luna. Their faces showed a mixture of scientific excitement and professional concern. Finally, Luna stopped at the edge of a small clearing. She huffed once more, then moved aside, as if revealing something to Rosie. At first, Rosie saw nothing unusual, just a fallen log, some early spring wildflowers, and the remnants of last autumn's leaves. Then she noticed a depression beside the log, and within it, something moving. She stepped closer, careful to move slowly. Luna watched, but made no move to stop her. In the shallow den lay 2 tiny bear cubs, so young their eyes were barely open. They squirmed and made soft mewling sounds, clearly hungry and distressed. But beside them lay a third, larger form, another female bear, completely still. Even from several feet away, Rosie could see that she was dead, her body already beginning to cool in the spring air. "Oh," she breathed, understanding flooding through her. "Oh, Luna!" The dead bear was younger than Luna, perhaps one of her own cubs from years past. And now her babies, Luna's grand-cubs, were orphaned and vulnerable. Luna made the strange sound again, the one Rosie hadn't recognized. This time, in context, its meaning seemed clearer. A request, a plea for help. Dr. Chen and the rangers had caught up and now stood at the edge of the clearing, taking in the scene with professional eyes. "The mother is dead," one ranger said quietly. "Looks like she might have had complications from the birth. See how thin she is? Probably emerged from hibernation too depleted to survive the strain. The cubs won't last a day without intervention," the other ranger added. Luna looked from the cubs to Rosie, making that same pleading sound. The message was unmistakable. "Help them, as I once helped you." Rosie turned to Dr. Chen and the rangers. "We have to save them." Dr. Chen was already pulling out her satellite phone. "I'll contact the sanctuary. They can prepare for orphaned cubs. But Rosie," she hesitated, looking at Luna. "We don't know how she'll react if we take them." Rosie looked back at the massive bear who had saved her life as an infant, who had somehow found her again across miles and years, who was now asking for her help in return. "She knows," Rosie said with certainty. "She brought me here specifically because she knows I'll understand." Moving with slow deliberation, Rosie approached the den. Luna shifted position but didn't block her access to the cubs. Up close, Rosie could see they were both females, their tiny forms perfect miniatures of their mother and grandmother. "We'll help them," she promised Luna softly. "They'll be safe." The Rangers had brought a small carrier for wildlife transport as standard equipment. With careful movements, they prepared it with soft blankets from their emergency kit. Rosie gently lifted each cub, checking them briefly for obvious injuries before placing them in the carrier. They were cold and weak, but still had good survival reflexes, squirming and vocalizing in protest at being handled. Throughout the process, Luna watched, occasionally making soft sounds that seemed to soothe the cubs. She made no move to interfere, though every natural instinct should have driven her to attack anyone touching such young bears. When both cubs were secured in the carrier, Rosie turned to Luna one last time. "They'll be cared for," she promised. "They'll grow strong and healthy, and one day they'll return to the wild." Luna rose onto her hind legs again, her full height impressive against the forest backdrop. She huffed once, powerful and resonant, then dropped back to all fours. With one last look at the carrier holding her grandcubs, she turned and moved away into the forest, her form soon lost among the trees. The rescue of the orphaned cubs became a pivotal moment in Dr. Chen's research program. With Rosie's unique abilities as an intermediary, they were able to document an unprecedented level of intentional communication between a wild bear and humans. The incident attracted attention from wildlife researchers worldwide, many skeptical until they reviewed the extensive video documentation and worked directly with Rosie. The cubs, named Willow and Ivy by the sanctuary staff, thrived under professional care. Rosie visited them regularly, her voice and her special huffing call seeming to comfort them in a way that reminded caretakers of their grandmother's influence. In an unexpected development, the research team discovered Luna regularly appearing near the sanctuary perimeter, particularly on days when Rosie was scheduled to visit. Though she never approached as closely as she had during their forest encounter, her presence was unmistakable. A watchful guardian ensuring her family's offspring were being properly cared for. By the time Rosie entered her junior year at the university, she had become an integral part of Dr. Chen's research team, co-authoring papers that were beginning to reshape scientific understanding of bear cognition and communication. The preliminary bear dictionary they had developed had expanded significantly, with increasing evidence that bears possessed more complex communicative abilities than anyone had previously documented. One crisp autumn afternoon, as golden leaves drifted down around the sanctuary, Dr. Chen joined Rosie at the observation platform overlooking Willow and Ivy's enclosure. The cubs had grown remarkably, their bodies strong and healthy, their behavior increasingly independent. "We'll be releasing them next spring," Dr. Chen said, watching the young bears forage through piles of leaves for hidden treats the caretakers had planted. "They've developed all the necessary survival skills." Rosie nodded, feeling both proud and a little sad. She had grown attached to the cubs, visiting them several times a week throughout their development. "Do you think Luna will find them once they're back in the wild?" Dr. Chen considered the question with her usual scientific thoughtfulness. "Bears have extraordinary sensory capabilities, especially for tracking family members. But normally, by this age, cubs would be establishing their own territories, often quite distant from their mothers." "But these aren't normal circumstances," Rosie pointed out. "Luna has already demonstrated behavior well outside typical bear patterns." Dr. Chen smiled slightly. "Indeed she has. Speaking of which," she handed Rosie a manila folder. The journal editor sent back the reviews of our latest paper. One reviewer is still pushing back hard on our interpretation of interspecies communication intent. Rosie sighed, having become familiar with the scientific community's skepticism over the past 2 years. Let me guess, Dr. Harriman from Cornell again? The very same. He wants more controls, more blind studies, more alternative explanations explored. Dr. Chen didn't sound discouraged. It's good science to be skeptical, Rosie. We just need more evidence, more cases like Luna's. Rosie stared out at the young bears, thinking about their grandmother somewhere in the vast forest beyond the sanctuary. What if we could document the reunion? When Luna finds them after their release, Dr. Chen's eyes lit up with the spark that appeared whenever a new research possibility emerged. Now, that would be powerful evidence indeed, but how would we know where and when to look? A plan began to form in Rosie's mind, one that drew on everything she had learned about bear behavior over the past 2 years, and on the inexplicable connection she still felt with Luna. "I think I might know how to find out," she said. The following spring, as the forest awakened from winter dormancy, a small team assembled at the sanctuary for the release of Willow and Ivy. The young bears, now healthy yearlings fully capable of surviving in the wild, had been gradually transitioned to a soft-release enclosure deep in the national forest, miles from human habitation, but within the general territory where Luna had last been documented. Dr. Chen had arranged for a small tracking collar to be fitted to each bear, minimally invasive devices designed to fall off naturally after approximately 1 year. Rosie had initially resisted the idea, concerned about anything that might interfere with the bear's natural behavior, but eventually agreed that the research value outweighed the minimal discomfort. What Dr. Chen didn't know was that Rosie had been making regular solo trips to the forest edge near the release site, making her distinctive huffing call at dawn and dusk, calling not to Willow and Ivy, who were still in their enclosure, but to Luna, who Rosie believed was still monitoring her family's descendants from a distance. On the morning of the release, as the team made final preparations, Dr. Chen pulled Rosie aside. "I've authorized the additional camera traps you requested," she said, a hint of curiosity in her voice. "But they're positioned much wider around the release site than our protocol usually calls for. Care to explain your thinking?" Rosie hesitated. Some of her intuitions about Luna went beyond what she could easily articulate in scientific terms. "I believe the reunion might happen further from the release point than we'd typically expect. Luna is smart. She knows humans will be watching the immediate area." Dr. Chen studied her face, then nodded slowly. "Your instincts about these bears have proven remarkably accurate. We'll do it your way." The release itself was deliberately anticlimactic. The team opened the enclosure gates before dawn, then retreated to observation blinds well away from the site. Willow and Ivy emerged cautiously as sunlight began filtering through the trees, testing their freedom with increasing confidence as the morning progressed. By noon, both young bears had wandered out of direct sight, though the tracking collars showed they were exploring in gradually expanding circles around the release point. "Textbook soft release behavior," murmured one of the wildlife biologists, watching the tracking data on a tablet. "They're sticking together and maintaining proximity to the familiar enclosure." Dr. Chen nodded, but her attention was on Rosie, who had been unusually quiet all morning, her focus intense as she periodically scanned the forest through binoculars. "You're expecting something," Dr. Chen said softly, so the others wouldn't hear. "What is it?" Rosie lowered the binoculars. "Luna will come for them," she said simply. "I've been calling her. She knows they're being released today." Had anyone else made such a statement, Doctor? Chen might have dismissed it as anthropomorphism or wishful thinking. But Rosie's unique history with Luna and her proven intuition about bear behavior gave her words weight. "How soon?" Dr. Chen asked, accepting the premise. Rosie checked her watch. "By sunset, but not here. She'll intercept them about 2 miles northeast, near the ridge with the lightning-struck pine." Dr. Chen's eyebrows rose. "That's remarkably specific, and conveniently within range of those extra camera traps you requested." Rosie smiled slightly. "It's where I've been meeting her." Dr. Chen's professional composure slipped for a moment. "You've been... Rosie, do you mean to tell me you've had direct contact with Luna, outside of research protocols, without safety measures in place?" "I trust her," Rosie said simply. "And she trusts me." Dr. Chen looked like she wanted to pursue the safety breach further, but the research opportunity overrode her concerns. "We should relocate our primary observation point, then. If what you're predicting comes to pass." "It will," Rosie assured her. By mid-afternoon, the tracking data showed Willow and Ivy had indeed begun moving in the direction Rosie had indicated. The team relocated to a new observation blind, one that offered a clear view of the lightning-struck pine that Rosie had specified. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the forest in golden light, the radio tracking signals indicated the young bears were approaching the ridge. Dr. Chen and her team watched through binoculars and high-powered camera lenses, the atmosphere in the blind tense with anticipation. "There," Rosie whispered, pointing to movement among the trees below the ridge. Willow emerged first, her dark form distinctive against the lighter forest floor. Ivy followed close behind, both bears moving with the natural wariness of wild creatures in unfamiliar territory. Dr. Chen adjusted her camera, capturing their movements. "Perfectly normal exploration behavior," she noted. "But I don't see any sign of..." She stopped as a larger, darker shape moved out from behind the lightning-struck pine. Luna, unmistakable in her massive presence, stood watching the approaching yearlings.